I swear, I host these just so I can hear that music every time. I love that music. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good everything to everybody. My name is Joe Lurie. I was just on the last AMA, so some of you might have seen me there. You might have seen me in some of the other AMAs. I typically introduce myself as the least important person in the room. All I will be doing is reading questions for our guests to be answering. So please keep posting those questions. I am here today with Perla and Maggie. Some of you have seen Maggie before here as well. I'm going to let them introduce themselves, but we're going to start with Perla.
Hello, everyone. My name is Pearl Morales. I am part of the customer solution team within the Intune product team, and I work with Maggie in terms of anything autopilot related in our advocates team.
And hi, everyone. My name is Maggie Dakiva. I'm the product manager for Windows Autopilot and excited to get all of your questions today.
And feedback. So we'll be asking for your feedback as well.
Definitely.
Yeah, for sure.
Great
And I know we have about 50 minutes or so. That's 50 minutes. But this is going to go by so fast. So we're going to get started right away with our first question. And this is, Maggie, I'm going to start with you. And Perla, I'd love for you to pile onto this as well. When should I choose user-driven versus self-deploying versus pre-provisioning when I start using Autopilot?
That's a great question. So the way we see user-driven is as the default. You should always start thinking about Autopilot with user-driven. That's the ideal flow that we aimed for when we created this. It's also the original one. The idea behind Autopilot is that you're able to send your devices directly to the end user, and they can do all the setup themselves. You don't have to pay for a technician to do it. You don't have to do any prep. You don't have to be involved at all. You can have your OEM send it directly to the end user. User-driven obviously is the one that also results in the device being tied to that specific user. So we see in certain scenario, self-deploying may be needed if you have userless devices, kiosks, Microsoft Teams rooms. It's more for specialized use case. And then pre-provisioning, we have some customers who prefer this flow, usually in cases where they have some prerequisites, they need to make sure on the device, or they want to make sure they deliver the majority of the configuration before the device makes it to the user. But it's really not needed. The ideal is that user-driven should be able to serve your purposes just fine, and you should make sure you deliver the absolute critical things during the UBI flow, let the rest be configured afterwards.
Yeah, especially with user driven, we want to empower the users to have the ability to turn on their device, go through the autopilot process, and get to work immediately. So that's why our number one recommendation is to use user driven for sure.
You know, in the last AMA, someone asked a question, what is one of the biggest mistakes you see IT admins make when they start moving to cloud native? And my biggest mistake, well, that I mentioned, not my mistake, my advice was I see customers that do pre-provisioning for their entire estate. Like when they start using Autopilot and they say, we're just going to pre-provision the entire estate because we want to mimic what we do with Configuration Manager, where they got an imaged device, was all set, they just needed to log in. And that's not really, that is a mistake in our opinion, right? You should use pre-provisioning for certain specialty type devices, but really the user-driven flow should be your default.
And that's a very good point. Generally, as you move into cloud native, you need to reconsider even your practices and how you're doing things. Is something like this still needed? And we still hear customers that need this for, let's say, I have my CEO, obviously I want to give them a device that's as ready as possible. But for the majority of our workforce, that's the beauty of cloud provisioning. It actually allows you to do remote setup of the device without requiring your IT technician to be involved.
Yep, for sure. Thanks, Maggie. Thanks, Perla. So we got this question in the last session, and because this is specifically Autopilot, and this question was about Autopilot, we're going to ask it here as well. And I would love to hear the answer to make sure that answer matches, the answers that we gave in the last session anyway. So question from tech community, how do we migrate 10,000 devices from a hybrid environment, Active Directory, Entra joint, to a cloud native environment? From Active Directory Entra to cloud native. Do I move them to Autopilot with a wipe, or is there a less destructive path?
Yeah, so unfortunately, one of the challenges with hybrid is that the only path that is recommended and trusted to work fine is completely wiping your device, resetting, and starting over. You can do autopilot with Entry Join as you wipe, so you can trigger the wipe remotely, and then autopilot will take care of getting the device Entry Join provisioned with the required policies. But unfortunately, that's one of the challenges with hybrid, where in order to move fully to cloud native, you will need to reset.
What we could do is also take advantage of how our organization does our device refresh cycle. So for instance, all the new batch or wave of new devices, let's go ahead and put them all in cloud, all cloud native. Let's see what tests, what works, what doesn't break. And then from there, keep testing until the next wave, right? So eventually, if you have a 5-year refresh recycle, device refresh recycle, you're able to then be in 5 years, be fully in the cloud. So that's a great strategy that a lot of companies are taking advantage of, taking that opportunity to have that phase approach.
Yeah, it's a great point, and that's really the answer we gave before. It was a combination of both of your answers. Was yes, you do need to do a wipe and a reload. Autopilot reset's a perfect way to do that. We recommend doing it on all new devices, any repurposed devices, any reset devices, any reason you would be resetting a device anyway. Go ahead and do those as autopilot cloud native. So we kind of gave a combination of both of your answers. So I'm glad that we got it right in the last one and we got it right in this one. All right, let's move on to the next question. Also coming from the tech community. Many of the GCC High customers, that's our government cloud. So the GCC High customers very much want to keep hybrid join, but are limited to autopilot device prep, which only supports Entry Join. Can you please reiterate the plans for hybrid join best practices, support, and long-term vision for Intune and autopilot teams with as much detail as possible, with a focus on our GCC High tenants? So, yeah, Maggie, I'm not sure if that's really a question or a feedback for you, but go ahead.
It is a great question, and we do hear this often, I assure you. We do know that many of our government customers do have hybrid environments currently. So to share a little bit of history there, hybrid was intended more as a transitional state where we wanted to help customers get to cloud and get to cloud native. But because of the nature of how it is and the fact that hybrid autopilot got introduced, so new devices kept being brought in, which required then reset, as we spoke in the previous question, reset to go to Entry Join. That kind of prolonged that state. So many organizations are continuing to use hybrid. And I'll tell you, one of the things we learned through enabling hybrid for autopilot commercial is it's really not a great experience. It is taking longer to set it up properly. It has some additional dependencies. It has some parts of the flow that are not optimal and are taking longer as well. So we don't see this as being our North Star experience. Autopilot device preparation is where we wanted to build our North Star experience. And ultimately, autopilot, the way it all started was it was seen as the modern provisioning or really cloud remote provisioning for devices. So something like hybrid, I think, will not do you service. It is more the service to you because it will keep you in that state for even longer time. It will bring the extra headache of having to manage this to the point that the better solution, I think, if you still have to keep bringing in new devices, would be honestly to use something like imaging, keep them in hybrid that way. And then when you're ready to start fresh with autopilot with Entry Join only. That'll be, I think, the most optimal. So at this point of time, we don't plan on bringing hybrid join to autopilot device preparation. And just as a reminder, autopilot device preparation is the major solution that government customers will have. The autopilot, the classic one, the original solution, will not be brought to government clouds. But I'll say that we are making a lot of improvements to the experience end-to-end with device preparation. So you will be getting actually a better, more optimal experience and the one that's easier to onboard to as well.
And when it comes into hybrid deployments, I think one of the conversations that the leaderships in security and also in your devices management is the question is, do we still need that hybrid join? What's stopping us from going full cloud? And essentially the challenge that even when Joe and I speak to customers, is like, let's just grab a couple devices, test it, go through the entire autopilot process, and let's see what breaks and what doesn't break. And some, even the success stories come down to like an entire device team comes in, they do the deployment, and then they completely show the team the device, or the security team, they show like, hey, this is a fully Entra cloud only device. Is it still meet your security standards, right? And then testing and seeing and figure out what breaks, what doesn't break. And I think that's the biggest challenge that we want to bring to you all, especially with this MA sessions. Like, have you tried fully Entra? What's working, what doesn't work? And then from there, we could provide support additionally, where either it's applications that are outdated, our applications that need to be modernized, right? There's something that we could always help with when in terms of where you're going fully cloud, especially within the new features that are coming on, not within Intune itself, but all Microsoft products. Most of the requirements are them to be fully Entra joined. So that's something that's beneficial to consider going fully cloud for sure.
Thanks, Perla. Thanks, Maggie. We got a question. I'm gonna use the term because I'm reading the question from Tech Community. I'm not a fan of using V1 and V2, but I will say V1 here when I talk about this as I read this question. When you're using Autopilot V1 in a hybrid environment, at what point do you recommend installing the security tools? And I'm not sure exactly what the question is asking, but well, let's just say you have security agents that have to install as part of Autopilot. So I think that's the question, is how do we make sure that those security tools install as part of Autopilot?
Yeah, so this one is a little bit hard to answer because it really depends on the tool, the dependencies it has. I would say there are some known issues with specific security tools which may break your Autopilot flow, and we don't really have control over because we don't control what each of the app vendors is building. So what we've seen is that some customers are actually delivering them at the end of the flow after you get to the desktop. Best thing would be to try out and see, but if you do see an error, usually that's the first place you have to look when you're troubleshooting, like your security tools, and confirm if the issue is not coming from there. If it is, then you have to make sure they're delayed and are delivering at the desktop. So meaning they're not part of the enrollment status page.
Yeah, and I would say when the enrollment status page, we do allow, a number of apps to install before we actually get to the desktop. And probably you want those security tools to be, some of those required apps in the enrollment status page. Perla, I think you were about to say something as well, so I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, you're fine, Joe. Especially with ESP, it's about making sure you're installing the applications that are absolutely necessary, right? And then the other applications, you can make them available through the users, through the company portal app, or install them later after the deployment. So those ESP page and the applications that you choose, make them super, super relevant to your organization that are absolutely necessary during the deployment for sure.
And I think that ties into the next question as well when we're talking about deploying those apps. And it also goes into some of the things we talked about in the last session is the user doesn't need it. They have 50 apps installed in their desktop. They don't need all 50 apps installed the second they log in. They need Office, they need Teams, they need the security tools, they might need a VPN client. But that once a month app that they run at the end of every month, yes, they're going to open the start menu, they're going to see that it's not there yet, and they're going to call the help desk immediately. But it is coming down to their device. I think that's a lot of that's going to be user communication on what to expect at first login. But that next question coming in from Tech Community, how can we ensure the right persona-based apps are delivered during or after Autopilot without causing delays or failures in the provisioning process?
Yeah, so there are a couple of approaches there. What I've seen customers do and are successful with is they could either classify devices based on the personas they will go to, if you know that in advance. Often that is done by setting up these groups of devices based on the use case for the device and the type of user persona. And you can do device-based targeting in that way, if you know these devices are going to these users. The other option is to let them still target them to users and have the user enrollment status page block the experience. But I see that as not optimal as well, because then the user has to wait for even longer for their apps to be there. There is an alternative I've also seen work for certain customers, maybe not for everyone, but I've seen many people who are successful with this, where they will set the absolute minimum critical things in Ubi and then put everything in the company portal. So the user can go and install as available whatever they need right now. They can grab it whenever they need it. They don't have to necessarily wait for everything to be setting in the background. And maybe their app is the one that came last, so they had to wait for an extra hour for that app to come down. So that is another approach.
For sure, the company portal provides a self-service. And then if your user starts from autopilot self-deploy mode, then they're getting that mentality set where we're empowering them to go ahead and be self-sufficient, whether they're doing the OB process, whether they're installing applications, rather than influxing your help desk with a lot of tickets. They have the ability to go to the company portal, select the applications they want, download them, and if it fails, they could go ahead and retry. And after that, the company portal also provides information for the help desk as well, if that fails for sure.
One of the things I probably should have said when we were talking about some of the mistakes that IT admins make in the last session, or even this one where you're talking about causing delays or without causing delays, one of the biggest mistakes I see is overusing dynamic groups in Entra, especially when you're talking about app deployment or something like that, because if you're device targeting an app and you're using dynamic groups in Entra, that autopilot device has to be enrolled into Intune. It has to be added to this dynamic group, which the sync of that dynamic group could be up to 24 hours before the device is actually in there. And so that's the biggest delay that you might see with apps. So not using dynamic groups might also be a way to, not cause any delays with those provisioned apps in autopilot. All right, we have a question from tech community. What is the best practice to prevent device enrollment on a non-company purchased device? Enrollment allowed only on devices purchased from partner vendors, or if devices purchased outside of our vendors, enroll using only a specific Azure account. How can we make sure that personal devices aren't enrolled? We'll start with that.
Within Intune, we have the ability to block personal devices so that we could go ahead into like the device enrollment and block those personal devices. And then when it comes down to the device enrollment process and registering those devices, the vendors have their own little portal where they go ahead and say, like, I identified this device belonging to to your corporations. And then let's say if you have a user or you have an IT admin that went ahead and purchased a device by themselves and they want to go through the autopilot process to test, there's also a process where we identify, upload the hardware hash, or if they go through the APDP process, then they go ahead and when identify the device as corporate owned. So there's a couple of ways that we could do that as well. Another way that we could then also block is using conditional access rules, where we could say, I only allow personal devices that are able to either access our applications or making sure that the device is enrolled into Intune as well. Maggie, do you have any other hacks as well?
I think this was great. I was just going to kind of call out again the corporate identifiers. It is something that's available for almost all platforms at this point. We did add support for this in Windows as well a couple of years back. It is what we recommend currently for Autopilot device preparation, but honestly, it can be used for any enrollments, even if you're not using Autopilot at all. Even if you're using Autopilot, you could add it if you have, if you want to have a restriction based on, let's say, a specific model that you want to restrict on. So that is another option to mark the devices as known. And in that case, for the corporate identifiers, you need serial number, model manufacturer. So you need to make sure your user has some way to pass these over to you as well, so you can upload and their device is allowed to enroll. But generally, it is best practice to make sure personal devices are blocked in your organization.
Thanks. And someone's asking a clarifying question from something I mentioned earlier. So is it recommended to use user dynamic groups for application deployment for autopilot, seeing as device dynamic groups could be slow and can be missed? I'm just going to say don't use dynamic groups for app deployments. I'm going to full stop. And that's Joe Lory talking. I'm not saying that's a Microsoft official recommendation. That's a Joe Lory recommendation. Dynamic groups, generally speaking, can be slow when it comes to deploying policy or apps in Intune. But Maggie, Perla?
That's some of the trends that we have seen, and a lot of customers noticing that feedback. And we definitely want to make sure that those applications don't lag in terms of group dynamically. So that I definitely agree with you, Joe, in terms of like the behavior that we're seeing and the feedback we receive with customers.
And the only place where dynamic groups can be used safely is if you're doing registration for Autopilot and you're creating your groups based on properties that are related to Autopilot. It could be like you want to group all your devices that are Autopilot devices, or you're assigning things like the group tag or order ID, and you want to group that way. Because we have device records that are created in advance. The devices have usually plenty of time to get into the groups, so that is the only option that you can see in places in our documentation referenced and recommended. But again, that's more for the purpose of making sure you have granular targeting during your onboarding experience.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We
And
got this. Yep,
any
go
other,
ahead.
including based on the device name, is not going to be recommended because the device name will be set up during the provisioning process itself, and then calculation of that group will take quite a bit.
Yep. Oh, for sure. That's another mistake that I do see is people using device name because maybe they're a bank and the devices are named by the branch or whatever hospital group, and it's named by the hospital it's in. And then, as you said, the device name happens later on in the autopilot process, so it takes longer to calculate that within a dynamic group, for sure. We got a question from LinkedIn. And I can see this. I talk to customers about this sometimes as well when they have like two different tenants, a dev tenant and a prod tenant and things like that, or during a merger. Is there a way to export device hardware hashes when migrating from one tenant to another using Autopilot? I'm going to say before using Autopilot. So Maggie,
Yeah.
how can I migrate my hashes that are already registered in one tenant? How can I migrate those over to my prod tenant, as an example?
So unfortunately, we don't have an easy button of just get all hashes, move them over to this other tenant. One of the things you could do is collect through logs the information. The information will be there. Get it from their log files, and then upload them in the new tenant. You have to make sure you clean them up from the old tenant as well. This is a fair scenario that I hear pretty often. We have not had a chance to optimize for it yet. So there is a way currently. It's just not an easy thing that we have enabled natively, unfortunately.
How about another question from LinkedIn? How about click once applications with Autopilot? Is there a way to deploy a click once app with Autopilot?
What's the meaning of click one applications?
Yeah, let's see if we can get some follow-up on that one on a click once application. I think a click once application is they get the executable on their device and they just need to install it themselves. But we'll get some clarification on that one.
Okay.
We have an AI question from Tech Community. Now that Microsoft Scout is positioned as Microsoft's first Autopilot agent, how is Microsoft thinking about naming clarity across the portfolio? Should we expect any rebranding of Intune Autopilot, since Scout just also used the word Autopilot?
I would say fast. This one. I'll also remind people that Autopilot is a Windows feature, so Intune Autopilot probably wouldn't work. But no comments on branding at this time.
Yeah, it's funny. It is Windows Autopilot, not Intune Autopilot anyway. So it's not even just Autopilot. It's Windows Autopilot. Go ahead, Perla.
I just think we'll see if we know about any rebranding. We'll definitely let the community know. There's just always been questions, especially like Maggie likes to ask, like, what would you like Autopilot device preparation to be named? So if you have any like insights or any ideas, put them in the comments, and we'll consider them too, just in case for clarity as well. So that's something that we're always looking for feedback from customers and ideas. And I mean, some of the branding that we have came from customers. So if you have any feedback or comments on that, add that in the chat for sure.
Yeah, I don't see us renaming Autopilot, but if you have any ideas, aka.ms/Intune feedback, give us your feedback, give us your ideas. Frankly, I think Scout should rename what they called Autopilot because honestly, we had it first. Let's go to the next question from Tech Community. In what scenarios does Autopilot struggle to fully replace traditional imaging and what best practices can help overcome these limitations? And I'll stop that part first, and then I'll go. It's quite a long question, so let's start with just that. In what scenario does, and I don't want to use struggle to fully replace. In what scenarios is autopilot different than traditional imaging, and maybe a process might need to adapt?
Yeah, I think some examples that come to mind there are related to the physics of the process. So things that may take a long time. Let's say you want to do feature update. That is not going to be optimal for your end user to just go through that experience. It's not going to be maybe as stable. It's one of the reasons we haven't brought that functionality there as well. And then some of the other examples are where you might want to make sure you have some things there before the process even starts. You have some network requirements or things that need to be provisioned in order to even connect to the network in the first place. These are some areas where you may have to consider how you want to do that. I've seen customers use pre-provisioning for these purposes, actually, where they have a specific certificate that they need to get there so that the user can actually continue the provisioning. So these chicken and egg situations are traditionally harder because ultimately we rely on network connectivity, and we don't have a great way to deliver things to a brand new device before you even connect to the network for the first time. So those are some of the limitations. We often hear customers quote some specific features they may have today that are used or that they're used to with SCCM that they don't see in Autopilot. And generally for those, there are two approaches we take. We'll either try to understand your business scenario. Well, we always try to understand your business scenario, to be fair, but we'll try to understand what you're trying to achieve and see how actually we can do it. Or we'll make a recommendation of how you should be reconsidering what you're doing today. And that might not make sense to bring to the cloud native world, because a lot of things that admins do were due to the original architecture of how SCCM was set up, of the feature set that it had, or maybe even how processes were. Like so many things have changed since then. So we always encourage customers to reconsider whether or not they need that complexity. Generally, we're more biased towards making things simpler. And our goal is to make sure things work so that admins have to make minimal efforts. Obviously, we're not perfect yet. But that's why we welcome any and all feedback, and would really like to make sure where we can make targeted improvements to have the optimal end user experience where everyone feels comfortable just handing the device over to their user. The user can provision it, and they know what is happening the entire time, and they can be productive fairly quickly.
One thing you mentioned is ultimately we do require a network connection. Of course, you need some kind of drive on the device. We also need an operating system on the device. So bare metal reset or might also be a scenario which imaging still is right now is the winner, unless you have a USB that you can at least get the operating system onto the device, and then we can use Autopilot after that. But we do need some sort of an operating system on the device to use Autopilot. The rest of that question, additionally, what common misconceptions exist around achieving minimal IT touch or true zero-touch deployment? And how can these be corrected in real-world enterprise implementations? So Autopilot, we talked about this earlier. Perla, you mentioned that user-driven is really where we want our customers to go. Well, user-driven isn't zero-touch. So what are some of the common misconceptions that exist around achieving a minimal touch IT?
I think a good common misconception is that the users have to do all the work. If anything, all the background work in terms of the IT decisions have already been made. It's only when they come down to Autopilot, go through the out-of-box experience, where the end user then says, okay, I'm going to just log in, make sure, identify who I am, make sure we are securely going through MFA process and anything. And after that, all the policies, so all the pre-work has already been done for the end user. and all those tough decisions have already been gathered on their behalf. So I think that's one of the things where end users are like, well, what have they thought about the applications that I need? Yes, we have. We went through all the use case scenarios, right? Have they thought about all the security protocols? Yes, we have. Also, what about the applications that I might need in the future that are executable? Yes, IT admins have thought about using solutions like EPM or enterprise privilege management, right? So those are all the pre-work has been done in them, and having that mindset like we're shifting you from being always calling the help desk to making you more self-empowered to do the activities, to be more productive in every activity that you use in terms of making your work easier for you.
I think the other one might be also around like trusting the user that they'll be able to manage and provision their device. And what is interesting to me is I see a lot of admins, they trust their users to provision their mobile devices. They don't trust them to do the Windows one, their Windows device. Maybe part of the reason is because in SCM, the user was used to just getting a device that's ready to go. But one of our major goals with designing Autopilot in the first place was to streamline that experience so it's as easy as possible and as foolproof as possible as well. So the users can actually go through it. And we do see lots of companies out there that are successfully doing that. So there might be some sort of a mindset change as well that sometimes need to happen within our organization, where you can trust your user to do the process themselves. And usually what we see is when customers do a pilot, they see it for themselves actually, that the user can get there.
It's funny, if you haven't used Autopilot before, user-driven deployment starts with obviously plugging it in and lifting up the lid if it's a laptop. And then the first screen that they get when they power it on is, what country are you in? A user can answer that. The next one, when they click next, is what keyboard layout do you want? For me, I want US English, or I want France. Then next, and then connect to your home Wi-Fi, which we can't connect for you, so the user knows their home Wi-Fi. And then it just, all the provisioning is happening on the device without the user clicking anything. And it's those first three steps that the company thinks the user is going to be lost. Not that they can't answer the question, but they weren't expecting to have to answer the questions. They want to make sure they answer it correctly. And again, I think I mentioned earlier, sometimes it's user communication on what to expect, and then they can go from there. But it is true that user-driven deployment is not zero touch, but it's not designed to be zero touch. It's not zero touch on either side, but it's very light, minimal touch.
I think that term was a bit problematic in general. Like, you have a physical device, you can't just not touch it at all. So that's why, like, lately we're trying to refer more to it as remote or cloud provisioning, things like this, because that's closer to zero touch, is a little bit too extreme.
I agreed. We had a question about using Windows 365. So we are looking to use Windows 365 Cloud PCs. If we implement this, how are those virtual systems put into Autopilot? Just one correction. Windows 365 Cloud PCs aren't virtual systems, they're cloud PCs. Don't get it confused with AVD, Azure Virtual Desktop. But anyway, if we do implement Windows 365, how are those virtual systems put into Autopilot?
That's a great question. And I assume when you're saying put into Autopilot, you probably mean registered for Autopilot. And the answer is you don't need to do that at all. With Windows 365, actually, in the past few months, we have slowly rolled out support for Autopilot device preparation policy for all of their SKUs. And that will give you the best experience, because that allows you to target the policy to a set of cloud PCs and ensure that required apps and policies get there. You can use technically enrollment status page, but that is a little bit limited today, where it will only pop up at the desktop. It is blocking the user from accessing. So device preparation policy will be the preferred method. In terms of registration, you do not need to register cloud PCs. The whole idea with registration is to, one, make devices known to us, to Intune, to our Autopilot service. And then the second part is ensure these are secure, trusted devices that are allowed to enroll in your environment. With Windows 365, the devices are, the device creation process, all of it is actually managed by Windows 365. So we trust the service that is creating them and is then calling us to get the right device preparation policy. We trust that service, so that's why we don't need and we'll never need registration in those scenarios. So at least we have this thing, that this extra complication that we will never need for cloud PCs.
Cool. All right, thanks, Maggie, and for the whole explanation on cloud PCs. We had a troubleshooting question from tech community, and I just wanted to be known we're not help desk. We don't have all the tools available that the help desk users have. We don't, that support has, but we do have a troubleshooting question that came from tech community, so we'll see what we can do with that. Autopilot device provisioning is not completing successfully, and we are encountering an error stating something went wrong, error code, and then 80004005. However, the issue resolves automatically after some time. What could be the reason behind this? I'm going to say, typically speaking, the 005 error is a permissions issue. You simply don't have rights. I don't know what it is specifically for Autopilot. So, Maggie, have you seen this as you're working with engineering on what could go wrong?
I think in my experience, and I recognize this is an area where we can do better with the error codes and error messaging. One error code can be due to multiple various things. One place where you can look is usually the Autopilot documentation. We have a troubleshooting section, a known issues section. So this is a good place to start with. Generally, for many of those, we'll need to take a look at the logs. So a support case will be needed. So that way we can get the information. It can get escalated as needed and all of that. But a good starting place is always our troubleshooting section because it could be different factors and you can see which one may be relevant to you.
When then we have the autopilot process, there might be a timing issue where we have a lot of services running at once, even like applications that are competing for the resources to get downloaded and installed. So all those could be an accumulation, which means that we get a generic error. So definitely looking into the logs is something that will give us more of a what happened case. And if an issue that's running over and over in terms of like different deployments within your scenario and enterprise, we really need to look into that. Sometimes we do have a one-off time scenario and it might be like the service is waiting for another service to complete. So it's all about like looking what we're seeing in the patterns that you see when you're doing your deployments.
Thanks, Perla. We have another, I think might be considered a troubleshooting question. What are the most common reasons a newly enrolled device remains stuck as not evaluated or pending for compliance? What's the best route to determine next steps? And I don't know that this is an Autopilot question specifically, but it's possible that the person who asked this question is seeing this more with Autopilot devices. The best way to, the newly enrolled device remains stuck as not evaluated or pending for compliance. What are some of the reasons that we see for that?
I'm not an expert necessarily in compliance. One thing I would say is making sure there's network connectivity and that the device has synced recently as well. Sometimes you may have to trigger local sync as well just to make sure, or ask the user to go to company portal and kick off the sync from there. Yeah, that's the only thing I can think of from on top of my mind. So if none of that helps, again, you might have to reach out to support to get more assistance.
A newly enrolled device also is synced periodically with our intern service in terms of compliancy. So within the first 24 hours, the sync is happening very frequently. So it could be a matter of let's check if there's a compliance policy. What is that device checking in for that specific device compliance policy? Is there a compliance policy delivered to that specific user or device? So those could be all the reasons. And then if it's pending for compliance, definitely. And if it's taking more than 24 hours, let's go ahead and raise the ticket to see what's going on that device. Because at the compliancy, we're definitely looking at that all your security measures are being implemented first and are being evaluated. So that will be something to be checking within the first time as a newly device is enrolled as well.
Thanks, Maggie. Thanks, Perla. We got a question about apps in Autopilot. So thinking about the apps that we deploy through Autopilot, what are the best ways to keep apps that are deployed through Autopilot up to date? we are an MSP, so looking after multiple clients, and it's a bit of a challenge keeping them up to date. What's the best way to keep these apps up to date?
So I think I may have a follow-up question there. Are you referring to you're updating the apps generally in the targeting to the group, but then you need to have the extra step of updating in the enrollment status page maybe, and that part is challenging? Is that what it's about? And are you able to also replace the app that's in the enrollment status page with your new updated version at the same time that you're updating it in the portal? Yeah, so I'd love to hear more details there and see maybe there's room for improvement, honestly, for this goal.
I would say it depends on the type of app that's being deployed. If a store app is being deployed, it should keep itself up to date. If it's a Win32 app, when you deploy an update, you can check the box that says supersede existing apps. So I think it depends on the type of app that's being deployed, how it's being deployed, at what point it's being deployed as well. So Maggie had a couple of good follow-ups, and we can follow up with you after we get some answers to that. Just for everyone else's knowledge as well, the comment section is open until this Friday. I don't know the date. Today is the 23rd, so 4th, 5th, 6th, something like the 26th at noon. So you can continue asking questions. So if you're watching this as a stream, an on-demand stream, continue asking questions. We will keep following up with questions all the way until Friday at noon Pacific time. Again, I think it's somewhere around the 26th or 27th, whatever that Friday is. All right, so we get another question about ESP this time. How many apps can I assign during ESP before I start seeing timeouts and failures? I think it's going to depend. There's a lot of factors here, but Maggie, how many apps can I assign during ESP before it starts causing timeouts?
This is hard to answer for your environment, for the network speed that the end user will have when they're provisioning. Generally, our recommendation is to keep the apps at the minimum, and under 10 apps is what we advise for. Same as with timeout, it depends on what you set your timeout for ESP to be. You should aim for something reasonable. Obviously, you don't want to set something like 6 hours and have your user stare at the screen for 6 hours. But yeah, general recommendation, especially when using the user-driven flow, obviously, is to keep it up to 10 apps. It depends what your apps you have as well, right? Obviously,
How many?
Yeah, a simple store app will not be the same as Office, right? So generally something like Office, you may consider delivering at the desktop after you're out of Ruby, because that is known to take up some extra time.
Our best practice is to have a most minimal during the ESP page. And then another good practice would be to make sure individually each application installs, kind of have that timing range as well. So all that before going and actually deploying through Autopilot through your whole fleet. So that's something that we need to check into. Also, like for applications that require reboot, right? That's something that we need to consider, or applications that might have a port installer. So those are all the factors that come in when we're talking about the application during ESP, and why the answer is depends, right? It depends on what decisions are you making.
Yep, thank you. This next question that came in, I'm gonna read the question part of it first, and I'll go back and read the use case. With Autopilot device prep, there's no longer a pre-provisioning, what we used to call the white glove service. Is pre-provisioning coming to Autopilot device prep, or is it a recommended way to stage warehouse devices before they reach the user? For many customers, we pre-stage devices and inventory before we ship to the end user when we're using the legacy or the original Autopilot service. So we would pre-provision apps like Office. We want to make sure that they're already installed. Autopilot device prep has removed pre-provisioning. Is that coming back, Maggie?
So with Autopilot device prep, our goal was to make sure we start with a scenario that's closest to our vision for the North Star, as well as, quite frankly, the most used scenario. User-driven is the most used scenario today. So we prioritize that flow and continue to prioritize that flow to make sure we deliver the optimal experience. We have a specific vision of what we want the experience to be. We want to make sure end-to-end of it is faster. You have even better reporting, even for beyond the UBI stage as well. So right now our focus remains on that. We'll evaluate additional modes once we complete fully that story. As many of you know, there are certain gaps that still exist with out-of-pod device prep that we do want to close, and we have provided that update in the past as well. So this remains our main focus for the time being. Keep an eye on announcements for things in development and all of that. We'll share more where we have more updates. I do hear the feedback, and pre-provisioning is a common thing that we hear from many customers as a flow that will be desired. But again, as we spoke earlier, our North Star flow is really the user-driven, and we want to make sure that flow is the best onboarding experience your users are going to have.
I'm gonna go back to our Intune feedback page here. I am sure that if you look at aka.ms/Intune feedback, you will see someone has already given feedback for please bring pre-provisioning to Autopilot device prep. If you see that, go ahead and give it a thumbs up, like that feedback. If you don't see it, go ahead and add the feedback. But aka.ms/Intune feedback, and let us know your thoughts on that. Okay, what is the cleanest way? Another question. I'm sorry, I usually preface this with, hey, we have a question. What is the cleanest way to re-image or redeploy a device without running into duplicate or stale device records? So if I want to run an autopilot reset as an example, what's the best way to do this without getting a duplicate or stale device record, Maggie?
So this will depend on whether your device is registered or not. You may see a different behavior there. Generally, with devices that are registered, we have this extra logic to keep the records around, so they're reused. This is optimized so that we reduce the load on Entra. With your regular entry join devices that are not registered for Autopilot, if you're using any of those flows, generally you have to make sure you clean up those old records before you re-enroll the device. So you have to keep, in that case, you have to keep an eye on that. If it's Autopilot registered, we're taking care of it, and you shouldn't have to worry about that aspect.
Great, and we have time for one more question, so let's make this quick. What are the biggest mistakes that slow down Autopilot deployments at scale, and how do we avoid them? I don't know if we can do that one quickly, but what are some of the mistakes? Perla, you and I talk to customers all the time, so I'll let you start here. What are some of the mistakes you see your customers make when they go to do Autopilot at scale, and how do you avoid them?
One of them is doing hybrid deployments. That's for sure one of our biggest pain points. Another one is to deploying a large set of applications during the ESP, which could lead out to timeouts. So those are the two biggest ones that I have. So my recommendation is let's go ahead and go fully cloud and minimize those applications that are required during the OB experience. How about you, Maggie? What do you?
I'd imagine also in general trying to do too much and stick so much in Ubi, including like custom scripts and logics here and there that can make things overcomplicated. Trying to replicate essentially your SCCM task sequence into Autopilot is never a good idea. It also should not be needed. If you find that it's needed, come talk to me. I'd like to understand why and see how we can fix that, because we definitely don't want that level of complexity in Autopilot. If things are not working properly, and we do hear some feedback of this as well, so it's not like that's the first time I'm hearing this, but I'd love to find out even more and hear specific scenarios, so feel free to share. And the other piece is also overcomplicating it in terms of even modes, trying with all the modes at once. I would say start with user-driven, see where you may need an additional one, but start with the simpler setup. Don't overcomplicate by trying to make all of the same things work at the same time, and trying to adjust all the different ones. I think it takes quite a bit of time and fleshing out to make sure everything works properly. So start with one flow, generally the simplest ones, and add the others as needed. You may also find they're not needed. You thought maybe they were needed, but you find user-driven is actually solving for most of your cases. So you can just stay with that.
Yep,
it's a great opportunity for cleanup, for sure.
Yeah, that's the one I was going to say. And I said at the beginning of this session, pre-provisioning for all of your devices is not scalable. It's not enterprise scalable. Pre-provisioning is great for the use cases that require it, for those specialty device type of devices. But don't test with all the modes. Start with user-driven. Send your user some communication on what to expect. Let them go through the process. If you find you have some issues, then tweak your process. But pre-provisioning, I think, is one of the biggest mistakes I see when an enterprise tries to scale, is just by doing pre-provisioning for, they have 60,000 Windows devices and they decide to pre-provision 60,000 Windows devices. All right, so thank you so much, Perla. Thank you, Maggie. Thank you all for joining. QA, again, is open until 12 p.m. noon Pacific time on Friday. I'm going to say it's the 26th. I think it's the 26th. Next up, we have a Microsoft Ask Microsoft Anything, keeping up with security, compliance, and the pace of change. You can view the entire schedule, including the ones that we've just had at aka.ms/TCL/Intune. Thank you so much, Perla, Maggie. Thanks for your time today. We'll see you all soon.
Thanks all.
Bye.